Chapter 17. The hotel of the provincial town where Nikolay Levin was lying ill was one of those provincial hotels which are constructed on the newest model of modern improvements, with the best intentions of cleanliness, comfort, and even elegance, but owing to the public that visits them, are with astounding rapidity transformed into filthy taverns with the pretension of modern improvement that only makes them worse than the old-fashioned, honestly filthy hotels. This hotel had already reached that stage, and the soldier in a filthy uniform smoking in the entry, supposed to be a hall porter, in the cast-iron, slippery, dark, and disagreeable staircase, and the free and easy waiter in a filthy frock-coat, in the common dining-room with the dusty bouquet of wax flowers adorning the table, and filth, dust, and disorder everywhere, and at the same time the sort of modern, up-to-date, self-complacent railway uneasiness of this hotel aroused a most painful feeling in Levin after their fresh young life, especially because the impression of falsity made by the hotel was so out of keeping with what awaited them. As is invariably the case, after they had been asked at what price they wanted rooms, it appeared that there was not one decent room for them. One decent room had been taken by the inspector of railroads, another by a lawyer from Moscow, a third by a princess from the country. There remained only one filthy room, next to which they promised that another should be empty by evening. Feeling angry with his wife because what he had expected had come to pass, which was that at the moment of arrival, when his heart throbbed with emotion and anxiety to know how his brother was getting on, he should have to be seen after her instead of rushing straight to his brother, Levin conducted her to the room assigned them. "Go, please go," she said, looking at him with timid, guilty eyes. He went out of the door without a word, and at once stumbled over Marya Nikolaevna, who had heard of his arrival and had not dared to go in to see him. She was just the same as when he saw her in Moscow, the same woolen gown and bare arms and neck, and the same good-naturedly stupid, pock-marked face, only a little plumper. "Well, how is he? How is he?" "Very bad. He can't get up. He has kept expecting you. Are you with your wife?" Levin did not for the first moment understand what it was that confused her, but she immediately enlightened him. "I'll go away. I'll go down to the kitchen," she said. "Nikolay Dmitrovitch will be delighted. He heard about it, and he knows your lady and remembers her abroad." Levin realized that she meant his wife and did not know what answer to make. Come along to him," he said. But as soon as he moved, the door of his room opened, and Kitty peeped out. Levin crimsoned both from shame and anger with his wife, who had put herself and him in such a difficult position. But Marya Nikolaevna crimsoned still more. She positively shrank together and flushed to the point of tears, and clutching the ends of her apron in both hands, twisted them in her red fingers without knowing what to say and what to do. For the first instant, Levin saw an expression of eager curiosity in the eyes with which Kitty looked at this awful woman, so incomprehensible to her, but it lasted only a single instant. "Well, how is he?" She turned to her husband and then to her. "But one can't go on talking in the passage like this," Levin said, looking angrily at a gentleman who walked jauntily at that instant across the corridor, as though going about his affairs. "Well, then, come in," said Kitty, turning to Marya Nikolaevna, who had recovered herself, but noticing her husband's face of dismay. "Or go on. Go, and then come for me," she said, and she went back into the room. Levin went to his brother's room. He had not in the least expected what he saw and felt in his brother's room. He had expected to find him in the same state of self-deception which he had heard was so frequent with the consumptive, and which had struck him so much during his brother's visit in the autumn. He had expected to find the physical signs of the approach of death more marked, greater weakness, greater emaciation, but still almost the same condition of things. He had expected himself to feel the same distress at the loss of the brother he loved, and the same horror in face of death as he had felt then, only in a greater degree. And he had prepared himself for this. But he found something utterly different. In a little dirty room, with the painted panels of its walls filthy with spittle, and conversation audible through the thin partition from the next room, in a stifling atmosphere saturated with impurities, on a bedstead moved away from the wall, there lay covered with a quilt a body. One arm of this body was above the quilt, and the wrist, huge as a ray candle, was attached, inconceivably it seemed, to the long thin bone of the arm, smooth from the beginning to the middle. The head lay sideways on the pillow. Levin could see the scanty locks wet with sweat on the temples, and tense, transparent-looking forehead. It cannot be. That fearful body was my brother Nikolay, thought Levin. But as he went closer, saw the face, and doubt became impossible. In spite of the terrible change in the face, Levin had only to glance at those eager eyes raised at his approach, only to catch the faint movement of the mouth under the sticky mustache, to realize the terrible truth that this death-like body was his living brother. The glittering eyes looked sternly and reproachfully at his brother as he drew near, and immediately this glance established a living relationship between living men. Levin immediately felt the reproach in the eyes fixed on him, and felt remorse at his own happiness. When Constantine took him by the hand, Nikolay smiled. The smile was faint, scarcely perceptible, and in spite of the smile, the stern expression of the eyes was unchanged. "You did not expect to find me like this," he articulated with effort. "Yes? No?" said Levin, hesitating over his words. "How was it you didn't let me know before? That is, at the time of my wedding, I made inquiries in all directions." He had to talk so as to not be silent, and he did not know what to say, especially as his brother made no reply, and simply stared without dropping his eyes, and evidently penetrated to the inner meaning of each word. Levin told his brother that his wife had come with him. Nikolay expressed pleasure, but said he was afraid of frightening her by his condition. A silence followed. Suddenly Nikolay stirred and began to say something. Levin expected something of peculiar gravity and importance from the expression of his face, but Nikolay began speaking of his health. He found fault with the doctor, regretting he had not a celebrated Moscow doctor. Levin saw that he still hoped. Seizing the first moment of silence, Levin got up, anxious to escape, if only for an instant, from this agonizing emotion, and said that he would go and fetch his wife. "Very well, and I'll tell her to tidy up here. It's dirty and stinking here, I expect. Marya, clear the room," the sick man said with effort. "Oh, and when you've cleared, go away," he said, looking inquiringly at his brother. Levin made no answer. Going out into the corridor, he stopped short. He had said he would fetch his wife, but now, taking stock of the emotion he was feeling, he decided that he would try, on the contrary, to persuade her not to go into the sick man. Why should she suffer as I am suffering? He thought. Well, how is he? Kitty asked with a frightened face. Oh, it's awful, it's awful. Why did you come? What did you come for? Said Levin. Kitty was silent for a few seconds, looking timidly and ruefully at her husband. Then she went up and took him by the elbow with both hands. Kostya, take me to him. It will be easier for us to bear it together. You only take me to him, please, and then go away, she said. You must understand that for me to see you and not to see him is far more painful. There I might be of a help to you and to him. Please let me, she besought her husband, as though the happiness of her life depended upon it. Levin was obliged to agree, and regaining his composure, and completely forgetting about Marya, he went again into his brother with Kitty. Stepping lightly and continually glancing at her husband, showing him a valorous and sympathetic face, Kitty went into the sick room, and turning without haste, noiselessly closed the door. With inaudible steps she went quickly to the sick man's bedside, and going up so that he had not to turn his head, she immediately clasped in her fresh young hand the skeleton of his huge hand, pressed it, and began speaking with that soft eagerness, sympathetic and not jarring, which is particular to women. We have met, though we were not acquainted at Soden, she said. You never thought I was to be your sister. You would not have recognized me? He said, with a radiant smile at her entrance. Yes, I should. What a good thing you let us know. Not a day has passed that Kostya has not mentioned you and been anxious for you. But the sick man's interest did not last long. Before she had finished speaking, there had come back into his face the stern, reproachful expression of the dying man's envy of the living. I'm afraid you are not quite comfortable here, she said, turning away from his fixed stare and looking about the room. We must ask about another room, she said to her husband, so that we might be nearer. Chapter 18. Levin could not look calmly at his brother. He could not himself be natural and calm in his presence. When he went in to the sick man, his eyes and his attention were unconsciously dimmed, and he did not see and did not distinguish the details of his brother's position. He smelt the awful odor, saw the dirt, disorder, and miserable condition, and heard the groans, and felt that nothing could be done to help. It never entered his head to analyze the details of the sick man's situation, to consider how that body was lying under the quilt, how those emaciated legs and thighs and spine were lying huddled up, and whether they could not be made more comfortable, whether anything could not be done to make things, if not better, at least less bad. It made his blood run cold when he began to think of all these details. He was absolutely convinced that nothing could be done to prolong his brother's life or to relieve his suffering. But a sense of his regarding all aid as out of the question was felt by the sick man, and exasperated him. And this made it still more painful for Levin. To be in the sick room was agony to him. Not to be there, still worse. And he was continually, on various pretexts, going out of the room and coming in again, because he was unable to remain alone. But Kitty thought and felt and acted quite differently. On seeing the sick man, she pitied him. and pity in her womanly heart did not arouse at all that feeling of horror and loathing that it aroused in her husband, but a desire to act, to find out all the details of his state and to remedy them. And since she had not the slightest doubt that it was her duty to help him, she had no doubt either that it was possible, and immediately set to work. The very details, the mere thought of which reduced her husband to terror, immediately engaged her attention. She sent for the doctor, sent to the chemist, set the maid who had come with her and Marya Nikolaevna to sweep and dust and scrub. She herself washed up something, washed out something else, and laid something under the quilt. Something was by her directions brought into the sick room, something else was carried out. She herself went several times to her room, regardless of the men she met in the corridor, got out and brought in sheets, pillowcases, towels, and shirts. The waiter, who was busy with a party of engineers dining in the dining hall, came several times with an irate countenance in answer to her summons, and could not avoid carrying out her orders, as she gave them with such gracious insistence that there was no evading her. Levin did not approve of all this. He did not believe it would be of any good to the patient. Above all, he feared the patient would be angry at it. But the sick man, though he seemed and was indifferent about it, was not angry, but only abashed, and on the whole, as it were, interested in what she was doing with him. Coming back from the doctor to whom Kitty had sent him, Levin, on opening the door, came upon the sick man at the instant when, by Kitty's directions, they were changing his linen. The long white ridge of his spine, with the huge prominent shoulder blades and jutting ribs and vertebrae, was bare, and Marya Nikolaevna and the waiter were struggling with the sleeve of the nightshirt and could not get the long limp arm into it. Kitty, hurriedly closing the door after Levin, was not looking that way, but the sick man groaned, and she moved rapidly towards him. "Make haste," she said. "Oh, don't you come," said the sick man angrily. "I'll do it myself." "What say?" queried Marya, but Kitty heard and saw he was ashamed and uncomfortable at being naked before her. I'm not looking," she said, putting the arm in. "Marya, come to this side. You do it," she added. "Please go for me. There's a little bottle in my small bag," she said, turning to her husband. "You know, in the side pocket. Bring it, please. And meanwhile they'll finish clearing up here." Returning with the bottle, Levin found the sick man settled comfortably, and everything about him completely changed. The heavy smell was replaced by the smell of aromatic vinegar, which Kitty, with pouting lips and puffed-out rosy cheeks, was squirting through a little pipe. There was no dust visible anywhere. A rug was laid by the bedside. On the table stood medicine bottles and decanters tidily arranged, and the linen needed was folded up there in Kitty's broderie anglaise. On the other table by the patient's bed there were candles and drinks and powders. The sick man himself, washed and combed, lay in clean sheets on high raised pillows, in a clean nightshirt with a white collar about his astoundingly thin neck, and with a new expression of hope looked fixedly at Kitty. The doctor brought by Levin and found by him at the club was not the one who had been attending Nikolay Levin, as the patient was dissatisfied with him. The new doctor took up a stethoscope and sounded the patient, shook his head, prescribed medicine, and with extreme minuteness explained first how to take the medicine and then what diet was to be kept to. He advised eggs, raw or hardly cooked, in seltzer water with warm milk at a certain temperature. When the doctor had gone away, the sick man said something to his brother, of which Levin could distinguish only the last words. "Your Katya." By the expression with which he gazed at her, Levin saw that he was praising her. He called indeed to Katya, as he called her. "I'm much better already," he said. "Why, with you I should have got well long ago. How nice it is." He took her hand and drew it towards his lips, but as though afraid she would dislike it, changed his mind, let it go, and only stroked it. Kitty took his hand in both hers and pressed it. "Now turn me over on the left side and go to bed," he said. No one could make out what he said but Kitty. She alone understood. She understood because she was all the while mentally keeping watch on what he needed. "On the other side," she said to her husband. "He always sleeps on that side. Turn him over. It's so disagreeable calling the servants. I'm not strong enough. Can you?" she said to Marya. "I'm afraid not," answered Marya Nikolaevna. Terrible as it was to Levin to put his arms around that terrible body, to take hold of that under the quilt, of which he preferred to know nothing, under his wife's influence he made his resolute face that she knew so well, and putting his arms into the bed, took hold of the body. But in spite of his own strength, he was struck by the strange heaviness of those powerless limbs. While he was turning him over, conscious of the huge emaciated arm about his neck, Kitty swiftly and noiselessly turned the pillow, fluffed it up, and settled it under the sick man's head, smoothing back his hair, which was sticking again to his moist brow. The sick man kept his brother's hand in his own. Levin felt that he meant to do something with his hand, and was pulling it somewhere. Levin yielded with a sinking heart. Yes, he drew it to his mouth and kissed it. Levin, shaking with sobs and unable to articulate a word, went out of the room. Chapter 19. Thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. So Levin thought about his wife as he talked to her that evening. Levin thought of the text, not because he considered himself wise and prudent. He did not so consider himself, but he could not help knowing that he had more intellect than his wife and Agafea Mikhailovna, and he could not help knowing that when he thought of death, he thought with all the force of his intellect. He knew, too, that the brains of many great men, whose thoughts he had read, had brooded over death, and yet knew not 100th part of what his wife and Agafea Mikhailovna knew about it. Different as those two women were, Agafea Mikhailovna and Katya, as his brother Nikolay called her, and as Levin particularly liked to call her now, they were quite alike in this. Both knew, without a shade of doubt, what sort of thing life was and what was death, and though neither of them could have answered, and would not even have understood the questions that presented themselves to Levin, both had no doubt of the significance of this event, and were precisely alike in their way of looking at it, which they shared with millions of people. The proof that they knew for a certainty the nature of death lay in the fact that they knew without a second of hesitation how to deal with the dying, and were not frightened of them. Levin and the other men like him, though they could have said a great deal about death, obviously did not know this, since they were afraid of death, and were absolutely at a loss what to do when people were dying. If Levin had been alone now with his brother Nikolay, he would have looked at him with terror, and with still greater terror waited, and would not have known what else to do. More than that, he did not know what to say, how to look, how to move. To talk of outside things seemed to him shocking, impossible. To talk of death and depressing subjects, also impossible. To be silent, also impossible. If I look at him, he will think I am studying him, I'm afraid. If I don't look at him, he will think I'm thinking of other things. If I walk on tiptoe, he will be vexed. To tread firmly, I'm ashamed. Kitty evidently did not think of herself, and had no time to think about herself. She was thinking about him, because she knew something, and all went well. She told him about herself even, and about her wedding, and smiled and sympathized with him, and petted him, and talked of cases of recovery, and all went well. So then she must know. The proof that her behavior and Agafea Mikhailovna's was not instinctive, animal, irrational, was that, apart from the physical treatment, the relief of suffering, both Agafea Mikhailovna and Kitty required for the dying man something else more important than the physical treatment, something which had nothing in common with physical conditions. Agafea Mikhailovna, speaking of the man just dead, had said, "Well, thank God he took the sacrament and received absolution. God grant each of us such a death." Katya, in the same way, besides all her care about linen, bedsores, drink, found time the very first day to persuade the sick man of the necessity of taking the sacrament and receiving absolution. On getting back from the sick room to their own rooms for the night, Levin sat with hanging head, not knowing what to do. Not to speak of supper, of preparing for bed, of considering what they were going to do. He could not even talk to his wife. He was ashamed to. Kitty, on the contrary, was more active than usual. She ordered supper to be brought, herself unpacked the things, and herself helped to make the beds, and did not even forget to sprinkle them with Persian powder. She showed that alertness, that swiftness of reflection that comes out in men before a battle, in conflict, in the dangerous and decisive moments of life, those moments when a man shows once and for all his value, and that all his past has not been wasted, but has been a preparation for these moments. Everything went rapidly in her hands, and before it was 12 o'clock, all their things were arranged cleanly and tidily in her rooms, in such a way that the hotel rooms seemed like home. The beds were made, brushes, combs, looking-glasses were put out, table napkins were spread. Levin felt that it was unpardonable to eat, to sleep, to talk, even now, and it seemed to him that every movement he made was unseemly. She busied herself arranging the brushes, but she did it all so that there was nothing shocking in it. They could neither of them eat, however, and for a long while they could not sleep, and did not even go to bed. "I am very glad I persuaded him to receive extreme unction tomorrow," she said, sitting in her dressing jacket before her folding looking-glass, combing her soft, fragrant hair with a fine comb. "I have never seen it, but I know, Mamma has told me, there are prayers said for recovery." "Do you suppose he can possibly recover?" said Levin, watching a slender tress at the back of her round little head that was continually hidden when she passed the comb through the front. "I asked the doctor. He said he couldn't live more than 3 days. But can they be sure? I'm very glad anyway that I persuaded him," she said, looking askance at her husband through her hair. "Anything is possible," she added, with that peculiar, rather sly expression that was always in her face when she spoke of religion. Since their conversation about religion when they were engaged, neither of them had ever started a discussion of the subject, but she performed all the ceremonies of going to church, saying her prayers, and so on, always with the unvarying conviction that this ought to be so. In spite of his assertion to the contrary, she was firmly persuaded that he was as much a Christian as she, and indeed a far better one, and all that he said about it was simply one of the absurd masculine ideas, just as he would say about her broderie anglaise that good people patch holes, but that she cut them out on purpose, and so on. Yes, you see, this woman, Marya Nikolaevna, did not know how to manage all this, said Levin, and I must own I'm very, very glad you came. You are such purity that... He took her hand and did not kiss it. To kiss her hand in such closeness to death seemed to him improper. He merely squeezed it with a penitent air, looking at her brightening eyes. It would have been miserable for you to be alone, she said, and lifting her hands which hid her cheeks, flushing with pleasure, twisted her coil of hair on the nape of her neck and pinned it there. No, she went on, she did not know how. Luckily, I learned a lot at Soden. Surely, there are not people there so ill. Worse. What's so awful to me is that I can't see him as he was when he was young. You would not believe how charming he was as a youth, but I did not understand him then. I can quite believe it. How I feel that we might have been friends, she said, and distressed at what she had said, she looked round at her husband, and tears came into her eyes. Yes, might have been, he said mournfully. He's just one of those people of whom they say they're not long for this world. But we have many days before us. We must go to bed, said Kitty, glancing at her tiny watch.